Welcome to episode 113 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. When we last left Mao Zedong, he had led his forces in taking the city of Chaoqing, and he had spent the first few frantic days after taking Chaoqing conducting social investigations, writing appeals to merchants, soldiers, and intellectuals to support the struggle, and working to set up a form of new and socialist public order in the city. The communists had marched into Chaoqing on March 14, 1929. Already on March 20th, the communists held a leadership meeting to decide on their next steps. Directly following this meeting, Mao drafted a letter to the Central Committee in which he gave a report about how the Red Army had fared since retreating from the Jinggangs base and what actions he planned to take in the immediate future. We don't need to spend much time on Mao's report on what all had happened since they had left the Jinggangs base, since we went over that in some detail in past episodes. However, I do want to just read out a short section at the end of that part of the letter in which he discusses the losses suffered along the way. Quote, "Since we started out from the Jinggangshan, we have lost a total of over 200 guns and 600 men. The greatest loss was that of cadres. This is most unfortunate. The hardship we encountered this time was the greatest in the history of the Red Army. Only by expending all our energy were we able to deal with these hardships and gain the present victory. The reasons we were able to overcome these difficulties are solid internal unity. Even during the most difficult times, very few soldiers defected, and among the cadres, Yuan Wencai and a handful of others left the ranks, and correct guidance by the party." End quote. Now, Yuan Wencai has been a major recurring figure in this podcast for some time now, so let's talk for a minute about his desertion of the Red Army before coming back to talk about the plans that Mao laid out for the Red Army's immediate future in his letter to the Central Committee. Back in episode 100, I talked about the policy adopted by the Sixth Party Congress regarding how the Red Army should relate to bandits and former bandits. The policy boiled down to the formulation that, before a given uprising, we can form an alliance with bandits. After the uprising, we should disarm them and eliminate their chiefs. This was interpreted by some leading communists in the base area to mean that Yuan Wencai and Wang Zuo should be executed. As we discussed in episode 100, Mao defeated that proposal and also suppressed the new party policy so that it did not become general knowledge, and even Yuan and Wang were not informed of it right away. As I discussed in that episode, this new policy did not reflect the communist experience in the Jinggangshan, where the experience with incorporating bandits into the Red Army had been very successful. But really, the Sixth Party Congress was not able to assimilate the Jinggangshan experience in any way. And there had been some other experiences that the party had had with bandits, some of which we discussed in earlier episodes of this podcast, such as the Autumn Harvest Uprising in Hubei in episode 59, that at least make the thought process behind this new policy somewhat comprehensible, even if clearly it would have been self-defeating to follow through on this policy in regard to the bandits who had joined the communist cause in the Jinggang Mountains. Anyways, at some point during the retreat from the Jinggangshan, either along the march route or during the rest that the Red Army took in Donggu that we talked about in episode 110, Yuan Wencai learned about this new policy and about the fact that basically the new official party policy was that he should be executed. He undoubtedly knew that Mao and Zhu De stood against this policy, but also knew that Mao might not be able to protect him forever if the party leadership was hell-bent on carrying out this policy. And by the way, in looking back at episode 100, I can see that I misspoke there about the length of time that it took for Yuan and Wang to learn about the new policy, which basically called for their deaths. In that episode, I said that it would be a few months before they learned about the contents of the Congress resolution, but what I meant to say was that it would be a few weeks, about 5 or 6 weeks more or less, from the time at the very beginning of 1929 when the information arrived in the Jinggangshan to when they actually learned about it. Now, Donggu is not, as the crow flies, very far from the Jinggangshan. There's a lot of up and down along the way and a big river and valley to cross, but if you look at a map, you can see that they are not super far apart. Having learned about this new policy and sort of entered into a kind of personal crisis as a result, Yuan Wencai deserted the Red Army during its rest and recuperation time in Donggu in the second half of February and headed back home to the Jinggangshan. When Yuan unexpectedly showed up at some point in March, Wang Zuo, who had remained with the force left behind, asked him why he had deserted the Red Army. Yuan explained that he felt threatened by the new policy and also felt homesick, so he returned back to his home territory, which was more familiar and hopefully safer. Actually, though, Yuan's desertion of the Red Army had put him in a much less safe position, because his local enemies could demand that he be punished for desertion, if for nothing else, and because he had no formal position in either the party or the army in the Jinggangshan. Wang Zuo contacted He Changgong, the new secretary of the Ninggang County Party Committee. He was someone we've met a few times in past episodes and was someone who had played a key role in integrating Wang and Yuan's bandit forces into the Red Army, and so was quite sympathetic to Yuan. Unlike Long Chaoqing, the former secretary of the Ninggang County Party, who He had replaced, and who was one of Yuan's enemies, as we discussed in episode 100. Wang and He worked out a situation where Yuan received a mild punishment, basically a reprimand, and was able to take up work as a local party cadre, but without any position in the army, at least at first. They also enlisted the help of Yuan's wife in keeping an eye on him and making sure that he didn't commit suicide because of his severely depressed condition, which they were very worried about. Yuan was badly needed in helping the base area to recover from the White Terror that had taken place when it was occupied by the Guomindang after the retreat first of Mao's 4th Red Army and soon afterward of Peng Dehuai's 5th Red Army. And as he progressed in his work of reconstructing the base area, his depression gradually faded. So that's the brief story of Yuan Wencai's desertion. One of these days soon I'll put together an episode on what all happened in the Jinggangshan after Mao left, and we will follow Yuan's story a bit further. Now, let's return to our discussion of Mao's March 20th letter to the Central Committee. Here's the key passage from the letter where Mao describes the current military situation in Jiangxia and western Fujian and what his plans are for the immediate future. Quote, "The Front Committee has decided on plans of action for the 4th and 5th Armies and for the independent 2nd and 4th Regiments of the Red Army in Jiangxia." Just as a reminder, the 5th Army was the one led by Peng Dehuai that had been left behind in the Jinggangshan, although it soon left. And the 2nd and 4th Regiments were the Red Army forces in Donggu. All right, back to the letter. At the initial stage of our fight against the Guomindang, there should be guerrilla warfare within an area of more than 20 counties in southern Jiangxia and western Fujian. From mobilizing the masses, we should proceed to the open establishment of independent regimes under Soviet power, and then connect these independent areas to form an independent regime in the Hunan-Jiangxia border area as a whole. The Jiangxia Red Army's independent 2nd Regiment, Li Wenlin's unit, has about 400 guns. It is strong in combat effectiveness and is now stationed at the juncture of Xingguo, Taihe, and Ganzhou. The independent 4th Regiment, Duan Yuequan's unit, has over 300 guns. It is still weak in combat effectiveness and is now stationed at the intersection of Xingguo and Yudu. Peng Dehuai's Red Army unit has about 300 guns and the remnant troops from the Jinggangshan and is stationed at the intersection of Yudu and Xinfeng. On March 7th, Peng's unit attacked the remnants of Liu Shiyi's unit and captured over 100 rifles, 1 water and 1 land machine gun, and several dan of bullets. Just as an aside, a dan is a unit of weight, which actually varied depending on the situation, but was about 50 or 60 kilograms, or between the two. Back to the letter. For about the next 10 days, the Red Fourth Army will operate on the Fujian border. Afterward, it will wage guerrilla warfare around Ruijin and Ningdu on the Jiangxia border. At that time, the action to be taken will be determined with reference to the battle situation in Hunan and Jiangxia, according to the best interests of the development of the Red Army and the development of the worker-peasant masses. We will either return to the Fujian border or conduct guerrilla warfare in southern Jiangxia for a longer period, or move closer to the Guomindang battle zone near Jian. The only plan that certainly must be carried out is to mobilize the masses within the regions of western Fujian and southern Jiangxia to the point of publicly establishing an independent regime. This plan should not be discarded as it is the basis for progress. To just sort of sum up what is written here, essentially Mao's saying, let's take advantage of this war that's breaking out between the Guangxia warlord clique and Chiang Kai-shek, what came to be called the Central Plains War, and start up guerrilla warfare nice and good across more than 20 counties in southern Jiangxia and western Fujian, with the aim of setting up a new independent Soviet regime, one occupying more territory and with a more solid economic basis than what they had had in the Jinggangshan. This was the overall plan, but we can also see that Mao was very much feeling out the situation, saying that he was going to take the army up around Ruijin and Ningdu and wage some guerrilla warfare and do some mass work up there, and then, depending on how that went and on how the overall political and military situation was developing with the Guomindang and the warlords, decide what to do next. You may have noted in the excerpt from Mao's March 20th letter to the Central Committee that I just read that Mao refers to some actions taken by Peng Dehuai's Fifth Red Army. What this means is that the Fifth and Fourth Red Armies had gotten in touch with each other, and the next step for them in coordinating their actions was to meet up and figure out what to do next. So, after 17 days in Chaoqing, the Fourth Red Army marched out and met up with the Fifth Red Army in Ruijin in southern Jiangxia on April 1st. Check out the map that I used as the episode artwork for episodes 109 and 110 to see where that is in relation to Chaoqing. Just like the Fourth Red Army had a whole dramatic story to its retreat from the Jinggangshan, through to their defeat of the Guomindang at Dabodi, their recuperation at Donggu, and then the capture of Chaoqing, the Fifth Red Army also had a very eventful and dangerous long escape from the encirclement of the Jinggangshan. When Mao Zedong and Juda broke out from the Jinggangshan on January 14th, they were pursued by one of the enemy brigades encircling the base area. This delayed the Guomindang offensive somewhat, but there was only so much that the remaining communist forces could do with the extra preparation time in waiting for the Guomindang assault on their mountain stronghold. There were about 1,000 to 1,200 communist troops trying to defend against well over 20,000 Guomindang soldiers. While the communists had prevailed over larger enemy numbers in the past, including at the Battle of Huangyangjie that we discussed in episode 94, the numbers that the communists were facing now were much stronger, and the communist leadership pretty much accepted the inevitability of the white forces overrunning the base area. The main question was, how long would the Guomindang occupy the area, and what would be the consequences of the occupation? While the communists did attempt to defend the base area at key points, one of the main elements of preparing for the Guomindang onslaught was preparing for how to hide from the white forces during the upcoming occupation. Communists who were from the area, such as the members of Wang Zuo's 32nd Regiment of the Fourth Red Army, which had stayed behind, had the option of trying to go underground and hide among family and friends in an area that they knew very well, although all the time hoping that someone who sided with the enemy didn't find out where they were and inform on them. But for people from outside the area, like Peng Dehuai and his 5th Red Army, the only real option for self-preservation was to follow in the 4th Red Army's footsteps and retreat from the base area. Still, they'd been assigned to defend the base, and there were also hundreds of Red Army sick and wounded who couldn't be evacuated. So, even while keeping the possibility of retreat in mind, an effort was made to defend the base, even though the communist leadership realized that it was probably a futile effort. On January 26th, the Guomindang launched a coordinated assault on the base, attacking all the main approaches to the base area simultaneously. They achieved their big breakthrough on January 29th with the help of a local informant, a rich peasant, or more accurately, a formerly rich peasant who resented having had his land confiscated, who guided the Guomindang forces up little-known and unguarded paths through a dense fog that covered their movements. They appeared suddenly on the flank of the communist defenders along the Huangyangjie approach up the mountain and threw the communist forces there into disarray, and then began marching in the direction of the communist headquarters at Siping, stopping at a communist hospital along the way to massacre more than 100 helpless patients there. Facing the imminent prospect of having the Red Army headquarters overrun, Peng Dehuai retreated with his troops to meet up with Wang Zuo and the 32nd Regiment at Wang's home village. There, Wang gave Peng details on a very high mountain path to the south that would allow the 5th Red Army to escape the base area. Then all the troops were assembled, and the several hundred local forces who wished to join the 5th Army in escaping swelled its ranks to 1,000 or more. The communists then executed about 24 local elites who they'd been holding captive and began their march south out of the base. Peng Dehuai describes the retreat like this in his memoirs. Quote, "For a whole day and a whole night, we followed goats' trails and climbed sheer precipices in the lap of the highest peak of the Jinggang Mountains. We slipped through the first ring of enemy encirclement. It was bitter cold. Snow fell in large flakes and covered the mountain with a white layer 1 foot deep. I lost my ration bag and ate nothing for 2 days. I did not want my comrades to know. Hungry and tired, I took every step with effort. But once rifle shots broke out, my strength returned. I do not know how. At Lan Cao Tien, we overcame a small enemy unit blocking our advance and broke through the second ring of enemy encirclement. On the 3rd day of our breakthrough, when we arrived at Dafen, we were ambushed by the enemy on 3 sides. We were in danger of being exterminated under enemy crossfire. I concentrated the forces of 3 companies to pierce the enemy position at one point, the only thing to do in such circumstances. We marched on south, cutting the last ring of enemy encirclement. But the enemy quickly sealed the gap and surrounded our wounded, sick, and disabled men trailing behind. We could not rescue them. The enemy had the advantage of numbers." End quote. Back in episode 108, we saw that when the 4th Red Army emerged from the mountains into Dafen, they had the good luck to surprise a Guomindang battalion there. But the 5th Army was not so lucky and ran right into a bunch of very well-prepared landlord militia troops led by Xiao Jiabi, an old arch nemesis of Wang Zuo and Yuan Wencai, who we met back in episodes 67 and 68. Only half of Peng's army managed to punch through the militia lines and move on. Everyone else, including the various Red Guard local forces and wounded troops who were accompanying the 5th Red Army on its retreat, had to go back up the way they had come into the mountains or were wiped out by the militia. After breaking through in Dafen, Peng continued to roughly follow the same route that Mao had followed south to Duan County. There, the 5th Army was caught sleeping in the middle of the night by enemy forces. Even the watch that had been posted had fallen asleep, according to Peng Dehuai. In the confused retreat that followed the surprise attack, half of the 5th Red Army fled east, and the other half, following behind but far enough away that they couldn't tell where the troops in front of them had gone, turned the other way at a crossroads and went into Guangdong province, where they were eventually wiped out. After this battle, Peng Dehuai was left with less than 300 men out of more than 1,000 who had left the base area with him. But when they got to Yudu County, the communist luck changed. Here's how Peng describes how things went in Yudu. By the way, in this quote, Peng uses the unit of measurement of distance li. 1 li is a half kilometer, or just under a third of a mile. Quote, "We reached Chaoqing in Yudu County in mid-February, where there was a secret local branch of the Communist Party and a small guerrilla unit acquainted with local conditions. They helped us gather intelligence about the enemy and provided us guides so that we could move about freely, and they helped us buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition. After we had taken a rest of 2 or 3 days there, the enemy came again. We moved to Liantang and Dongshan in Xingguo County, where there was also a local party branch, which had connections with small units of the 2nd and 4th Regiments of the Red Army in southern Jiangsu province. Remember, those 2nd and 4th Regiments are the ones associated with Donggu, the small Donggu base area. In wide areas, the presence or absence of underground party organizations made a world of difference. There we took a rest for about 5 days before the Liu Shiyi brigade of the White Army came to attack us. The local party branch informed us that the enemy brigade had only 5 battalions, one of which had stayed behind to guard the Yudu County seat with its civil corps. Now we had 300 men and 283 rifles. We decided to take action. We made a detour to keep clear of the enemy's main force and attacked Yudu County seat. We marched 140 li in 18 hours, arriving at the foot of the county seat's wall at midnight. We scaled the wall and surprised the enemy with a fierce assault. We wiped out 1 battalion, a pacification corps, and the local garrison, totaling 600 to 700 men. We captured 300 to 400 rifles and 2 light machine guns. The county magistrate escaped. We had been chased and intercepted by several enemy brigades for more than 1 month. Now, as soon as we settled in this area, we made a 140 li forced march and stormed a county seat. The enemy was completely taken by surprise. Moral: superiority without preparation is no real superiority. A well-prepared and courageous force can defeat a superior force that had made no preparations. After this battle, the civilians in Yudu called our Red Army unit the troops from heaven. Our men dressed the wounds of the prisoners after the battle and gave each wounded $2 silver as pocket money. We explained our policies to them and distributed leaflets. We put all the enemy dead in one place for the Liu Shiyi brigade to bury when it returned. The 300 prisoners watched us doing all this and were moved. More than half of them joined the Red Army." End quote. For the next few weeks, the 5th Red Army roamed across Yudu and neighboring Yuan County, conducting mass work and rebuilding its strength. And so, when the 5th Army met up with the 4th Army at Ruijin on April 1st, it numbered about 600 troops and had largely recuperated from the defeats that it had suffered as it escaped from the Jinggangshan. But whatever plans that Mao, Zhu, and Peng thought they were going to be making when they met at Ruijin, they quickly had to deal with a blow from an unexpected source. On April 3rd, a letter arrived in Ruijin from the Central Committee recalling Mao Zedong and Zhu De to Shanghai. We'll pick up next episode with a discussion of this letter. A little bit of housekeeping before I end this episode, though. Those of you who listen on Apple Podcasts may have noticed that there's a new transcript feature in that app. The thing about that feature is that it doesn't do a very good job with Chinese names. For example, at least last time that I looked, Chaoqing was getting transcribed as Chongqing, the capital of Sichuan province, presumably because that word is much more commonly used, and so the transcription AI assumes that is what I'm saying. So if you want an accurate transcript, I suggest going to peopleshistoryofideas.com, where I post the transcripts for each episode. Unfortunately, Apple will not let me upload my own transcripts to override those that it generates on its own. Okay, that's it for now. Until next time, be well.